Some Greeks come to Philip and they say, "We want to see Jesus." Philip goes to Andrew and tells him about it. Why did Philip do that? Why didn't Philip just take these Greeks straight to Jesus to see him? Well, you see, the Greeks are Gentiles, non-Jewish people. There was an understanding amongst some of the Pharisees that you shouldn't even enter the house of a Gentile. You certainly shouldn't speak to them in public. So Philip, having a Greek name, was the person who the Greeks approached, and they asked Philip if they can see Jesus. In broad terms, the understanding of the people of Jesus' time about the promise that was made to Abraham, the Jewish faith and relationship with God, was that the promise was made only to Abraham and to the people of Israel. That was who God's special relationship was with. Now, the Samaritans and the Arabs fit into that picture through being related to the Jewish people. But the Greeks are no relation. They're not connected to that sort of Jewish family tree of cultures. And so they're right outside, in a sense, the promises of God and the promise that was made to Abraham. And so Philip actually does quite a daring thing in taking them to Andrew. It's a surprise that he'll even go that far, to actually go and ask Andrew if these Greeks can go and see Jesus. And for Andrew to go to see Jesus is an even greater step. As a rabbi, a teacher, Jesus shouldn't really have had anything to do with these Gentiles. He was supposed to keep himself above and away from all that. They were thought to be unclean. And why were they prepared to do this? Why was Andrew, and before him Philip, prepared to take the risk of bringing these Greeks to Jesus? Jesus had already broken lots of these barriers in lots of different ways, particularly in John's Gospel. Perhaps one of the most outstanding examples of that is the woman at the well. A Jewish teacher really shouldn't speak to a woman in public, especially one he's not related to, especially one who comes to a well in the middle of the day, because such a person is likely to be of ill repute. It's only those who are on the margins, who are on the outside, who come to the well at the middle of the day. The sensible time is to come in the morning and the evening when it's cool. Now, after this, you might think that Jesus would welcome these Greeks, these people from the outside, with open arms as he'd welcomed others. Perhaps he did. There's a gap in the story. We don't know exactly what Jesus did about the Greeks. But what happens next is that Jesus seems to talk about things that have nothing to do with the Greeks who have come to see him. Instead, he talks about his glory. He speaks of his death. He speaks of being lifted up and Satan being defeated. What on earth has this got to do with Andrew, Philip and the Greeks? It's a bit like the surrealist who is asked what the time is and he says, "Oh, fish." Or like the joke, and this is a particularly silly joke, why do motorbikes have two doors? Well, because all ladies are bald, of course. But there is a connection. There's a connection between the Greeks coming to see Jesus and what Jesus says next. The key to understanding this passage and the connection between what Jesus says and the Greeks wanting to see him are verses 24 and 32. Both these verses are saying the same thing in different ways. Both these verses are about his death and resurrection and what that means for the whole world. In John 12:24, Jesus says, "I am telling you the truth. A grain of wheat remains no more than a single grain unless it is dropped into the ground and dies. If it does die, then it produces many grains." Jesus is like the grain of wheat. He must die and be buried, just as the seed must also be buried. But when the seed is buried, there's new life. A new plant emerges, and when that plant grows, it produces many grains. When Jesus died and was buried, that was not the end of the story. Instead, he sprang up to new life. And because of him, many, many people have also come to share new life. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. I've said several times that probably today there are around 1 billion people worshipping in the name of Christ on any given Sunday. And there are about 2 billion people who would at least nominally claim to be Christians. The other verse, 32, says that when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw everyone, or the old translations said, all men unto me. When Jesus says lifted up from the earth, he has in mind two things. Literally, he's talking about the cross and his death. John 3 last week, the snake lifted up on the pole in the wilderness, symbolising Jesus' death and also the notion that it somehow is connected with healing and forgiveness and restoration. But he's also talking about a kind of cosmic game of king of the castle. There is some sense that John believes that in the cross Jesus wins, that Jesus is left on top. And not just in the cross, the notion that God is ultimately the one who has the power. And so in this kind of cosmic battle, which God was always going to win, Jesus is kind of saying, well, in my life, particularly in the cross and in the resurrection, in my life is in a sense the final victory. Evil will continue after my death, but ultimately God is not only victorious as God was always going to be, but God will be seen to be victorious. Verse 31, now is the judgment of this world, now the ruler of this world will be driven out. He's talking about this thing called glory. Now glory literally is kind of light shining forth, but it's also about things like overwhelming goodness. Think of a glorious day. Well, that's a day that's just wonderful and fantastic. Or a glorious innings in cricket. That's an innings where it's without fault or it's really impressive. Or a glorious view. That's a perfect view, an inspiring view. And all those ideas are wrapped up with this word glory. The cross, Jesus is saying, is glorious. It's not glorious by itself. And it's not even glorious because Jesus died on it. And it's most definitely not glorious because of Jesus' suffering. But it's glorious because of what it represents. The cross represents forgiveness and transformation. And above all, it represents God's love for us. Jesus prays that God's name will be glorified. He prays that God's name will shine forth, that its overwhelming goodness will be seen and felt. And a voice replies from heaven, a bit like the story of the Transfiguration from some weeks ago. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. Now this is all wonderful, but where do the Greeks fit in? Well, they fit in two ways. Firstly, they are a sign to Jesus of what is to come. They are a reminder to him that he, like a grain of wheat, is soon to die. This is because they are a sign that God's love is going to be seen by all the world. Not just by Jewish people, not even just by Samaritan people or by Arab people, people who are related to the Jewish people, but they are going to be seen by all the world. The cross and the empty tomb are the signs that God never abandons us. Like the grain of wheat, like all things that live, like all human beings, Jesus has to die. But like the grain of wheat, Jesus also lives. He is raised to new life, and just as he shares our death, he also shares our life. And he shares this life with everyone. It began with these Greeks, but now the message of the cross and new life is spreading even to the most remote parts of the world. As I said, 1 billion people this Sunday are probably worshipping in the name of Christ. The Greeks are a sign for Jesus, that his death and new life are upon him. For they are a sign that God's love is about to begin spreading around the world. That's what the Greeks represent. They're the beginning of God's love spreading beyond the Jewish family of nations, the nations related to Judaism, to the rest of the world. And that leads to the second thing, the second connection. The Greeks are a sign for us about our part in this new life. You see, we are the Greeks. None of us, I think, are from those families of people who are related to the Jews. We are the Greeks. We are the outsiders. And yet, because of Christ, because of the cross, because of all the events of Easter, we have been brought into the centre of God's love. You see, it was because of Philip and Andrew and all the disciples, the Jewish disciples initially, including Paul, who followed after them, who shared the news of Jesus, that we got to meet Jesus. And it is also because of us that others will get to meet Jesus. You see, this story is a story about how God has come to meet us, but it's also a story on the human side of how we bring God to others, how we introduce others to Christ, and through Christ to God the Father. Amen.